Cool. Today we're looking at one of Androgynous Lemon's songs called Redbug. And I'm really excited to go through this session because it's a full band tracking session. So, for the most part, everyone played at the same time, and we overdubbed a few things like extra bass effects, synth, and some vocals. But yeah, for the most part, we used 2 live rooms with 2 isolation booths. So 4 rooms all up, but we had 2 people in the live rooms, so everyone had someone to hang out with. We had drums and bass, so Nikita and Ruben in one room on the left, and then on the right we had Amy and James on keys and vocals, and James on synth. And yeah, the idea was to get the feeling of everyone playing together and complete separation. Well, almost complete, but yeah, basically trying to get the best of both worlds. For the hearbacks in this situation, everyone was hearing what was coming out of the stereo out of Logic. So instead of having each individual member of the band create their own hairback mix and then play into the microphones at varying levels depending on what they're hearing, I decided I would control the mix from Logic. And the reason I did that was because I think, once you've got everything set up and all your inputs and tones sorted, I think the most important mix while you're recording is the headphone mix. And I decided to control that and have the band create a compromise between, giving me feedback, like a bit more of this, a bit less of that. I decided to do that so everyone would play evenly into the recording. So a lot of the mixing is actually done for me in a way because the band members are playing as they would if they were all in the same room because they're hearing the same source. To some degree. Yeah, not the usual way you'd do things, but I've found for this project and a couple others it's worked really well. But quite often you get people that are really keen to have full control over their mixes, which is totally fine. But yeah, and for the whole EP, I'll put a link in the description. It's really worth listening to. And hopefully I'll go into the other tracks at some point, but I thought this one would be a great one to start with. And yeah, I guess starting off with the bass, which cool, so there's a few elements of the bass. So while the band recorded all together, we of course had the bass DI. So this has given us a lot of attack. It's like a real sterile but very useful sound. And this is running through an LA2A, which is a common bass compressor. And something Toby got me onto, which was a bass rider, which kind of just, on top of the compression and color that the other compressors add, this one acts almost as like it's in the name, a rider or an automation tool. And yeah, on top of that, a bit of tape saturation, which I always find very useful. And yeah, in combination to the DI, I'm using a 441, which is a dynamic mic. And this one is adding quite a lot of character, and it is also being fed through the same signal chain as the DI. However, the point of difference is it's got a phaser on it, and this phaser adds like a stereo element to the bass sound. So if I play that on its own, you can hear that it's giving you a bit of differentiation in the left and right, whereas the DI is sitting mono and kind of keeping that center. So yeah, the mix of this phaser is automated in. So at the start of the song, it's a nice cleanish bass tone, and it kind of gets stranger as the song progresses. And also, if you look here, the phaser on the 441 is hitting the threshold, so it's not phasing drastically the entire time the performance is happening, but it's really working on those key notes to actually add almost a rhythmic element to the phasing itself. I can hear that particularly well in the left ear listening to it solo. Yeah, prior to going into that, it's got a huge amount of drive going in, but just a tiny notch in the mix, and that's just to add a bit of saturation to the 441, which is an excellent mic for bass. If I play it on its own, it's quite awesome, and I'll turn those two effects off. Very, very cool. Yeah, and on top of that, I did have a third mic, a third thing for the bass, which was another mic, but it wasn't used in this song, but it was used in other songs in the EP. And that was just because its tonal characteristic didn't sit well with this track that it did with others. And that's just all dependent on the bass's role at different times. And okay, so going into that, we've also got these were overdubs, and this is the bass. I believe it was with the volume knob of the bass being turned up through some effects. Cool. You can see the region ends here, and then a send of mine is sending it through a tape delay. Is on the oldest of the three tape formulas, which is also the darkest and the most lo-fi, I guess. And then from there, it's also got some Verispeed, which is a similar effect to what John Lennon would use on his vocals to make it seem a bit wider and a bit chorus, if you will. So yeah, 2 sets of tape effects on top of that section. And yeah, so that's basically how the bass functions throughout the song. And then after that, I should probably mention on the, I heard that before, on the bass track you can hear the slight amount of bleed from the drums, because obviously the bass cab was in the ISO booth and then the drums are in the live room where both players were situated. It's very faint, but you can hear a tiny amount of the snare in there, and that's cool. But you can tell that this the studio's isolation worked extremely well. Cool. So the drum sound I'm extremely proud of on this song. My personal reference for this drum sound was Blue Oyster Cult Don't Fear the Reaper, minus the cowbell of course, but that general 80s prog rock kind of sound, 80s, 70s kind of vibe. Yeah, we can listen to that on its own. Cool. So there's a shitload to unpack in this one. The majority of the sound, which I believe you should always try shoot for, of course depending on the context, is that the majority of the sound actually comes from the overhead mics. So these were two 414s, space pair configuration. So you can hear the overheads have an excellent sound all on their own. Even getting quite a lot of toms in the sound. And of course after that, the two tom mics, because people often ask me, where do you pan your toms? And I think, to be honest, it completely is reliant on where they exist in your overheads. So if we listen here, you can kind of pick out where they exist in the stereo spread, and then pan your overhead, your direct tom mics rather, accordingly. It doesn't have to be perfectly lined up to where you perceive the toms to be, but the closer it is, the more the overhead and the direct mic sound will reinforce each other if you've got no phase issues. And yeah, so we use 3 different kick mics, and yet again, in different tracks on the record, I use different amounts or levels of these different kick mics. And I guess the one that stands out is the sub mic. Which, as you'd expect from the name, has all the sub frequencies. And this has been automated in, as you can see, so it's coming in the choruses just to give more lift, whereas in the verse sections we're focusing mainly on the direct sounds that come from the D112. Very punchy sound, and the combination of nice room sound from the ribbon. And of course that's getting a shitload of bleed from the cymbals due to being a figure 8 mic, so it's not just picking up the sound in front, but also the room sound around it. Yeah, I think it adds a bit of dimensionality, although it can cause trouble with bleed and such. And yeah, so every track on the record has a different amount of each of these mics, and that's a really awesome thing about working on an EP, having like 3 different kicks and snare mics that you can kind of tailor to each track, so while using all the same mics is really handy. Yeah, so I guess that's an important point when planning a session that spans across multiple songs. Maybe take into consideration the kind of tonal characters and the genres of all the songs within the project and what you might need. Yeah. And yes, same goes for the snare, 2 on the top. It's a combination of a 57 and a 451, so a pencil condenser and the famous dynamic, the 57. And they've been taped together so that they're perfectly in phase, and then supported by the SM81, which is another condenser that was underneath, so a snare bottom there. And yeah, so these 6 mics, the 3 kicks and the 3 snares, are really quite coloured as well. They're all going through various compression. You can see the kicks are all being summed to 1 bus to go through the same tape machine and the same compressor. And then the snares are going through a similar compression style with a bit of saturation. Yeah, it's not a plugin I'd usually use, but it just really worked for this application. But yeah, if I soloed just the kick and snare, you're gonna wonder what the hell's going on, because they sound quite odd. You can hear like that its snare is really, really pumping into the compressor and the distortion, and on its own that would be far too much, but it is really just supporting this overhead sound, which is quite clean in comparison. See, much less aggressive when you put it all together. And yeah, for this track, that was kind of the role that the direct mics took on, was the aggressive, punchy transients and all the beautiful harmonic character from the saturation and such. But yeah, important thing here that I should probably get into is the editing. So you can see, especially in the choruses here, I have not used a gate. I have hand chopped all of these audio files, and I think that was an important decision because, you know, there's a lot of loud elements outside, like the crashes and the rides and, you know, interference between different things. And doing this aggressively and precisely with my hands rather than with a gate allowed me to compress it that much. So I was taming the signal, the cymbal bleed, very precisely. So when I compressed it, I knew I wouldn't have too much of that harsh cymbal coming through. And of course, pick and choose throughout the track where to edit and by how much. You can see here where there's quite a few snares close together. I didn't go in and chop every one because I knew that sustain would be very useful to have ring out instead of just choking out, and kind of supporting the overhead sustain as well. And yeah, and then you can see in the verses where the cross stick is happening. There was no way I was going to go in there and individually chop each one of those cross sticks. I'd rather instead, you know, let them ring out. And yeah, same goes for the hi-hat. You can see where the hi-hat's active. It's let to come through. So in the chorus, for example, it's not there at all, except for when you get a little sneaky hi-hat. And just like the kick and snare mic, it's based on color and character, so it's there to support the overheads. And for example, this hi-hat is being heavily EQ'd, so you can hear, for example, if I even pull that EQ back a bit, you immediately get snare. And what would happen is that you would hear snare a bit over here and here, because you're hearing it here in the overheads and in the direct mics, and you don't want another snare source essentially to be interfering with your perception of where the snare lies in the stereo image. So it's heavily EQ'd and saturated with this beautiful vinyl plugin, which really needs a tutorial all on its own. It's awesome. So yeah, this is really just adding color and character on top of the sound already present in the overheads, just like all the others. And the toms are doing much the same. They are kept quite clean though, running only through a compressor and a plate with quite a lot of wet signal in there. Because yeah, I know some people give their toms 100% wet signal just to support the overheads and get a real booming sound out of them. Hear them on their own. So yeah, same thing there, precisely editing. You know, they're just there for as long as they need to be. And yeah, while you could arguably do all of this painstaking editing with a gate, which you certainly could, you would then have to go in and automate the gate threshold for the kick and the snare and the hi-hats as the dynamics progress throughout the song, because you would lose so much. You would lose ghost notes, you would lose the sustain, like in the snares, for example. So really, you're better off doing it this way, especially for something that you want to sound quite professional. And yeah, it also gives you an insight when you're doing this painstakingly for hours. Gives you an insight into what role the kick and snare has in the verses, in the chorus. You know, what's it lining up with? Is it lining up with the bass or the keys? And that informs all the treatment down the line. And you end up knowing some parts of the song more intimately than the band members, at least for a time, while you're working on it. And then it all goes away for sure. Yeah, so there's a couple more interesting elements on the drums. 414 condenser mic, which was on Omni, so it picks up everything in 360. And this was smack bang in the middle of the kit, which can be quite annoying for the drummer, but we managed to find a nice spot for it. And it's called a crush mic because it gets crushed. And yeah, you see here. And yeah, the reason I chose this compressor is because you can really hear it pumping, especially when it gets into it. And yeah, so that just adds a sense of pressure and energy to the track. This is something I love doing. I'd say like 50% of the time it works, and then 50% of the time it just causes way too many phase issues. So take your time trying to get this right if you want to try it. It can be really useful. Let's see if I can mute it in this section and bring it back. On the way there, I'll see you. There's not much I would be great. Oh no, too much too soon. If you wanna place a bet on the way there, I'll see you. There's cool. Definitely hearing a lot more snare attack and just a lot more. It's like a parallel compressor almost, except acting on the mic instead of the whole kit and all the mics. And yeah, on top of that, we got a couple of rooms, a couple of ribbon mics. And yeah, they are being used selectively in certain parts of the song. You can see they come in the chorus, they come in the outro. And this is so, you know, the verses sound more focused, and then the chorus sounds more open, more roomy. And yeah, a trap you can fall into as a producer is you mic up the drum with this many mics. Jesus, how many is that? A lot of mics. And you can fall into the trap of just having a block and using them all at once. But yeah, use them sparingly and use them strategically for certain sections of the songs. And yeah, also I find doing it by hand again instead of automating it and gives you a visual representation of how the song develops. Yeah, cool. So the only other thing I want to talk about with the drums is that in the drop into the second verse, we've got a sweep. So the overheads, hi-hat, and a few other elements are all summed to this bus 15, and just a simple EQ sweep into the verse. Fuck yeah, that's the one. Cool, and that's just about adding a bit of interest. And yeah, let's listen to the drums and bass together for a bit. Cool. I can see here as well in the verses, I'm only letting the DI sustain out. And thinking back, the reason I would have done that is there's potentially bleed in the mic on the amp. So for that sustain, I'll probably just use the DI so I know I'm not sustaining bleed. Cool. Yeah, very happy with the strum sound. And as you'll see if we get into other tracks on the EP, the same set of mics can be used to create completely different kind of characters. Cool. And I guess part of the drums or percussion were these cymbals. So 3 different people performed these cymbals. Nikita played the cymbals with the mallets. Ruben spun this microphone here above the cymbal in this kind of motion, and that's the ACM80. You can find these on eBay or in junk stores, which is where I found my pair. And yeah, so that's that mic there. And then the third person that was performing this was James, who was running it through his Earthquaker pedal. I forget what model, but yeah, the handy thing about these mics is they have a jack lead, so straight from a condenser mic into a guitar pedal. It's very useful. And they're condensers, but they don't require phantom power. They run on batteries, so it's massively simplified. You don't have to run phantom power out from the desk or an interface with these. Really cool. Very, very low output as well. So they've got the detail of condensers, but they don't. They're not extremely loud, so you can drive the fuck out of them through pedals and stuff. They're awesome. So yeah, go to your local relic shop or whatever, or op shop. You might find some. So yeah. So rather than doing this all with plugins or what have you, we decided, each person is kind of informing the other. So the rate of Ruben's spin of the microphone will influence Nikita's playing and James's pedal work, and vice versa. So they're all interconnected, and also listening to the track. So creating these analog rises, if you will. And the other 3 mics are just helping with the stereo spread. So we've got a ribbon in the middle, and then 2 pencil condensers on the outsides. And that kind of gives the spinning mic its kind of Doppler-y stereo effect, because it's smacked in contrast with the stationary spread mics, if that makes sense. So you've got stationary spread stereo mics, and then you've got one that's in motion, which is causing phase and timing differences between your stationary mics, which give that essentially analog performed panning. And yeah, so throughout the chain of this, it's going through a multiband, and I've just really set thresholds where I have seen peaks come out, just so when they do spike, so yeah, that's just to tame down certain frequencies which I've honed in on. Bit of tape saturation to glue all the sources together, and then some side chaining from the snare bus. So I knew these were kind of crossing over a bit, so every time the snare hits, the cymbal's duck down, just so it can always be a strong element and cut through. And awesome. What are we on to now? Keys and synth. So just to recap, these guys, Nikita and Ruben, are in the same room, so that whole half of the session was in the same room. Whereas this whole half of the session was in another room. Cool, so the keys, these were a DI. I had an amp, but didn't have enough time to really get a setup of the keys going through an amp that we wanted. Kind of bit off more than we could chew in terms of setup time with that element. But yeah, keys, especially Rhodes, are always very hard to control because they've got a lot of complex harmonic content, and they're taking on melodic and rhythmic roles simultaneously. And yeah, also the Nord that we were using was quite noisy as well, so that was something I've fought with throughout the EP. So yeah, some very aggressive EQing because of the frequencies that were causing havoc. Bit of compression, and then the same saturation model that's on the snare is on this, with different settings, starting with a preset, and then tweaking in your own kind of style and what you want. Yeah, and then there's a duplicate of the performance, which is going out to recognize this. It's the same effects that the bass effects are going through. So the swells of the bass and the effects of the keys kind of have this thing in common, this kind of beautiful tape delay. Yeah. Yeah, 100% love Nords and Rhodes. But if you can, take the time to set up an amp, because I feel like an amp signal would have helped me a lot. And actually, you can get stuck in the woods if you're treating this in isolation all the time. You can hear that large amount of noise, which in the mixer doesn't actually matter. So yeah, it's always important to keep in mind the context that specifically this instrument has in the mix, whether it's melodic in some sections and rhythmic in others, and really making sure that it cuts through where it needs to and shares space with everyone else. Yeah, James's synth. So the ones performed, I believe, were these. The ARPs and the doubles were all done after the fact. And this it was an MS-20, so it was mono, so one DI input, a couple of mics on an amp, which worked really well. And yeah, it looks like I'm just putting a bit of verb on the condenser, so that's cool. And yeah, so the chain for this is quite complicated, and I think a lot of that will be explained in the kind of the textures that we're using here and why. Cool. So yeah, the majority of the reverb is coming from the condenser mic with all the lows and the detail, and using automation to selectively automate in and out the space echo delay, which is a very dark delay, and it's definitely what I wanted because, you know, there's so much bloody top end information on synths that I wanted the delay to be quite moody and dark rather than you know, a precise replication of the source material. That would be very distracting. And yeah, especially when we accumulate a lot of overdubs, I found it necessary, just like the keys, to have the first thing in the chain being this multi-band, which, you know, I would just target certain bands, pull it down till it was acting on the target areas. So it's not working throughout the whole song, but just when these sneaky little buggers, these resonant peaks, creep up on me, and then that kind of just pulls them down for me selectively. And yeah, compression afterwards, so it's the synth is arriving into saturation, rather. It's arriving into the saturation more evenly than it would if I hadn't have done this beforehand. Yeah, and on top of that, J37, and this is on the dark setting, and it's because it's the oldest of the three tape formulas that they use, and with a low tape speed, so it's focusing more on the mids and lows rather than the top end. And yeah, that was a decision me and James made together, switching through all of these, being like, what suits the character of the synths and its role in the song as well. And yeah, probably a shorter plate here. Yep, extremely short plate. Sidechain from bus 3, which I'm going to guess is the vocals, because they share a lot of space. I could be wrong. What? Maybe the kick. What do we reckon? No? Snare again? Yeah, snare. Cool. So, literally everything in the song is bowing down to the snare almost. Yeah, it was extremely fun recording all these synths. Obviously, we had this main section of synths from the performance. We did the arpeggios separately because they were set to a timer in the synth itself. So we did that after the fact to make sure it lined up perfectly, which James did an excellent job at doing. I remember when he tracked these, everyone in the room was like, "What the fuck, buddy?" Because you know, if you don't get the timing perfectly, they'll kind of move away from each other. And yeah, this section was nailed, and it's got some fun panning automation as well. Cool. And then the doubles in the choruses, you can probably see from the waveforms, there's a lot of soft analog clipping and saturation there, and that's all from this smorgasbord of mine and James's pedals that we strung together, just like essentially reamping synths through guitar pedals to give them interesting tones throughout the song.
If you wanna place a bet on the way there, I'll see.
And yeah, that's just to support the first performance here. You can see one's panned slightly left and one's panned slightly right, and together they create a wee harmony. And yeah. Yeah, I can hear the synth doubles have been a bit more rounded off. It sounds like they're going through my Joe Satriani distortion pedal, and I know in other songs we use a lot of different tones. And of course these mighty synth stabs, which
Redbug, burning hearts, just a little too much. Talk fast,
it's just a massive stack of synth harmonies doing this anime-esque little line. It sounds like a video game. Cool. I just realized the synths have been sidechained twice. It's from bus 3, which was the snare, and bus 13, which was the vocals. So it's actually been pushed out of the way at different points by two different elements. If we unsolo, we might be able to see this in action. Cool, so we can see the snare acting upon the top end on the right hand side. And if we skip forward to the verse, perhaps.
just a little too much. Redbug, burning hearts, just a little too much. Talk fast, walk a little slower, just a little too much. Hold steady if you're ready, it's a little too much.
Cool. So you can see the snare sidechaining is quite aggressive on the top end, whereas the vocal sidechaining is really only for when the vocals dig in. Awesome. Alright. Yeah, finally in this song, up to the vocals. On the day, we just used a 58 on a stand, which ended up being used in one of the songs in the EP because the performance was just spot on there. But for this one, we overdubbed them on a separate day, and yeah, used a combination of a 441, which is the dynamic, and the condenser, which is the 414, and yeah, they come together to create a complete sound. So let's just hear the 441. So this is the dynamic.
Silk water feeling long, just a little too much.
Sounds bloody good. It's a really good dynamic because it's got a brilliant switch, so you can get some of that top sizzly stuff alongside its like creamy character. So it kind of can seem like a second condenser almost. And this is the condenser on its own.
Silk water feeling long, just a little too much.
Cool. And this one's been heavily de-essed due to just the way this mic in this situation captured a lot of the so it needed to be tamed down before it went to anything else. And then the bus as a whole also has another de-esser, which will just be catching the sum of both mics if needed.
Long, just a little too much.
So yeah, when they're combined together, it's just gorgeous, I think. It's like creamy and detailed.
Silk water feeling long, just a little too much. Redbug, burning hearts, just a little too much. Talk fast, walk a little slower, just a little too much. Hold steady if...
So yeah, I think the 414 on its own sounds a bit hollow. The 441 on its own is lacking a lot of that body because the 414 is so good at picking up so much low end and top end detail. And together, obviously, they'll be interacting in terms of phase. So you want to spend a lot of time lining up those diaphragms as well as you can. But of course, there's always going to be differences because a singer will move, tilt up, look down, all sorts of things. But just use your ears, and yeah, if it doesn't work for you, it's no worries because you've got two options, you know. And yeah, I think certain sections we have doubles, and this is just to give the end of the line a bit of attitude when compared to the other parts. Might solo these.
Hold steady if you're ready, it's a little too much.
I often, when I'm mixing, imagine the music video in my head, and for this one it would be like split screen of like two people kind of like ready to go in a very anime-esque style. Yeah. Whereas in the choruses, the doubles are on the first lines to give them a bit more attitude, and then the melody carries on from there. Interestingly, the chorus vocals have a completely different chain to the verse vocals, and there's a few reasons for this. So, I should probably play it through and then reveal the weirdness, I think.
Too much too soon if you wanna place a bet on the way there. I see you, there's not much I would regret. Too much too soon if you wanna place a bet on the way there. I see you, there's not much I would regret.
Awesome. So, you can probably hear this sneaky sound coming in during the chorus and getting a bit more intense. And what that is the isotope vocal synth, which is well worth buying, especially if you're working in, well, any genre, but particularly pop. So this is producing a vocoder and a talkbox effect, although you can have many others and many combinations of each.
Wanna place a bet on the way there. I see you, there's not much I would regret.
So yeah, it's adding this synth-like video game texture, which is kind of the vibe of the song. It's like 70s, 80s, prog rock, funk, and yeah, arcade video games. That's at least how it came across to me, and that's kind of the things I pursued with it. So yeah, extremely good plugin, very creative vocal effects, very easy to overuse, very CPU intensive, but very cool. There's a lot of modular effects that you can move around. If this looks overwhelming, I'd recommend starting with a preset, figuring out how that preset works, and then, you know, learning it that way. And it's a relatively new plugin as well, so there's not as much information on it out there. But basically, you can turn on and move all these different modules. Your mix windows here, and you've got a mix level, so your dry-wet ratio, and a width and a gate. Gates are very useful if you only want it to come out on the more expressive parts, etc. And for this, I'm panning, I believe, just the mix. And yeah, the width kind of controls like where it's sitting, so it's not interfering with the main vocal, but it's spread out a tiny bit. And yeah, so yeah, this automates its way in on the first chorus and the second chorus. However, on the second chorus, the width is also changing. Oh no, that's the delay. Cool. Yeah, so it must be a delay throw on that last one.
How much I would be greater.
Hell yeah. Kind of gives the vocals a bit more attitude instead of using compression or saturation, using this like synthy color, which makes it sit with all the various other colors that have been thrown out by the cymbals, the keys, the synths, and the phaser on the bass. They're all just coming together. It's kind of like a unified style. Yeah, we're pretty much at the end there. Let me know if you have any questions about this mix. And although we're all in lockdown now, feel free if you're an artist or a band that might want to take this approach. You have a band. I believe we knocked out the guts of the recording for this EP in one day, so it's totally achievable. I've worked with bands that have done entire albums in one day as well. You've got to rehearse the hell out of yourselves to get that done, that's for sure. Or just come off of like a tour or something. But yeah, after this is all over, if you're keen for yourself or your band to use this kind of approach, get in touch. We've got various options for various budgets, and I pride myself at being very good with project management, so we can talk about what you need and how we can get there based on your budget, for sure. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a lot to unpack. I hope I covered everything. Like I said, if anyone has any questions, just drop them, and I'll get around to answering them. And I'm sure even more will be answered as we go into the other songs from this EP. Some Bad Haggard stuff and some of mine and Kaolana's early stuff. But yeah, thanks very much.